Добрий день, я вітаю всіх, хто приєднався до нас. Мене звуть Ольга Атаманова, і я рада вітати вас у медіа-центрі «Україна сьогодні». Сьогодні ми вас запросили, аби поговорити на важливу тему, поговорити про українсько-білоруські відносини. І назвали ми цей захід «Україна та Білорусь. Чи можливе безпечне сусідство та чи стане можливою співпраця?». Взаємовідносини, українсько-білоруські взаємовідносини можна назвати таким набіром суперечності. Якщо говорити до 22-го року, то ця країна входила в топ-3 економічних партнерів України, а вже у лютому 22-го ми розуміємо, що режим Лукашенка надав свою і територію, і підтримку агресії Російської Федерації. Але разом з тим зараз через цю територію відбувається повернення наших полонених і повернення наших громадян, які опинилися на території Російської Федерації. І знаємо, що, крім того, сумарна чисельність білоруських саме добровольців, що воюють на стороні України, одна з найбільших, якщо говорити і порівнювати з іншими націями. Тож, сьогодні будемо говорити про ці відносини у майбутньому, будемо шукати відповіді, наскільки вони можливі і в яких, можливо, форматах. Хочу представити вам наших спікерів сьогодні. Сьогодні з нами Ігор Tyshkevich, співзасновник мережі Research Solutions, Vadym Denysenko, керівник аналітичного центру Dilova Stolytsia, Iaroslav Chornogor, директор програми російських і білоруських студій ГО Рада зовнішньої політики Українська Призма, Zmicier Shchyhelski, ВО заступника представника з питань оборони та безпеки Об'єднаного переходного кабінету. Дякую, що приєднались до нас і вітаю. Пане Ігоре, вам відразу слово, тож давайте розпочнемо нашу розмову і поговоримо про пріоритети можливої стратегії України на білоруському напрямку.
Доброго дня. Так, будемо починати. Фактично я зараз зроблю коротку презентацію документа. Це не стільки policy paper, скільки зріз того, що ми маємо сьогодні, і оцінка можливостей, навіть не співпраці, тут питання в наявності політики України на білоруському напрямі, залежно від, в тому числі, сценаріїв розвитку подій, це і закінчення війни, і активність інших держав. А також, зважаючи на це, яким чином можна вже відбудовувати, починати з самого малого, тому що станом на сьогодні говорити про співпрацю, це було б дуже оптимістично, дуже зарано. Бо станом на сьогодні, якщо брати математичну шкалу, то відносини скоріше або біля нуля, або від'ємні, скажімо так,
або в мінусі.
Або в мінусі. Тому тут розмова на початку про те, як стабілізувати, і після цього дивитися, що відбувається, і чи це можливо. І давайте починати. Так, щось, перепрошую, клікер щось не працює. Куди? Ні, не хоче? О, пішло.
Сказав, що в руках модератора.
Да. На початку, скажімо так, просто декілька парадоксів співіснування. З однієї сторони, це дуже коротко, і більш подробно я описував ситуацію по Білорусі, кому цікаво, тут QR-код, це посилання на прогноз для Білорусі на 2025 рік. Але, з однієї сторони, це близькі культури та спільний кордон. Так, ми розуміємо один новий без перекладачів, культури спільні, плюс, якщо дивитися на дані Державної прикордонної служби України, щороку було більше за 2 мільйона заїздів громадян Білорусі на територію України. Для розуміння цього масштабу цих зв'язків, населення Білорусі зараз 9,1 мільйон за офіційними даними. Ну, рахуйте самі. А далі, неконфліктне минуле, тобто історичних суперечок практично немає, але при тому є абсолютно необізнаність нації одна про одну. І коли немає інформації, немає розуміння, є місце для міфів, де міф працює замість фактів, і, відповідно, є простір для маніпуляцій, в тому числі інформаційних атак, інформаційних агресій. І, на превеликий жаль, оскільки є міфи, оскільки ми вважаємо, що, я ще раз говорю, по обидві сторони кордону, що, якщо ми схожі, то думаємо однаково. Це не так. Але, на жаль, є такий підхід, що, відповідно, з точки зору білорусів, українці мають діяти як білоруси. Це логічно, раціонально. З точки зору українців, білоруси мають діяти як українці, тому що це правильно, це цінносно тощо. І от цей підхід, він викликає, ну, в кращому разі, нерозуміння з другої сторони. А чому так? І це також одна з причин таких, ну, певного нерозуміння і в політиці, і в комунікації. Ну і звісно, що співучасть в агресії 22-го року це є. Угу.
Попросимо нашу технічну команду спробувати
якщо можна, наступний слайд.
Зі слайдами.
Да. О, є. Далі по декількох міфів я дуже швидко пройдусь, тому що ми часто чули, що Білорусь там аграрна країна, все інше. Ключове ні щодо шаблонів. Перше, Білорусь не прагне стати частиною Російської Федерації. Парадокс. Бо якщо брати соціологію і російську, офіційну, і опозиційну, то 50+ % населення начебто за інтеграцію. Але якщо і це була проблема саме Російської Федерації, коли вони стикнулися з тим, що начебто за інтеграцію, за об'єднання виступають. Тому що коли копнули глибше, то за об'єднання в одну державу від 2,5 до 6%, останні зрізи – це 3,7%. Це зрізи місячної давнини. І ще в 2018 році вони послали для глубинок Білорусь там декілька груп соціологів, одні з них написали навіть книгу «Понять білорусів». Чому так? Тому що під інтеграцією пересічний білорус розуміє, ну, збільшення товарообігу, скажімо так, відсутність кордонів тощо. І от якщо брати, припустимо, зараз, як Білорусь оцінюють найбільш близькі країни, то найбільше симпатії зараз не Росія, це Китай. Ну, тому що з ним співпраця. Не радянська і не державна економіка. Так, і в документі це також є, тому що у валовій внутрішньої продукції державні компанії дають біля 36%. При тому, що якщо сусвітна практика державної компанії називається компанією з долі держави 50+, то по-білоруськи доля держави більш 40% вже вважається державною. От все це разом вона дає 36% валового внутрішнього продукту, вона дає менше за 30% експорту, а так станом на сьогодні в промисловості це 54%, але у всіх інших галузях ні. Не аграрна країна. Білорусь більш урбанізована країна, ніж Україна, і доля сільського господарки в валовій внутрішній продукції України в Україні в 4 рази більше, ніж в Білорусі. Тому аграрна країна питання, що називати, ну, дуже важко. Не заперте вдома населення. Ще раз перевірив, коли писав дані, з 2013 року білоруси світові лідери по кількості шенгенських віз на душу населення. Це дуже мобільна нація, але на відміну від сусідів, це нація, яка їде кудись і повертається. Тому от горизонтальні зв'язки – це дуже важливо, і це дається в знаки потім. Неповний ефект російської пропаганди. І це показово, от далі буде в тому числі і по Україні слайдик, але це показово, тому що пропаганда, особливо негативна щодо інших країн, вона працює тоді, коли ти сидиш вдома. Але дуже важко білорусу, який, припустимо, в 19-20 році їздив там спочатку до моря, після у Львів, і там та ж сама кав'ярня Краївка, вона була дуже популярна серед білорусів. Коли він приїздить додому, йому говорять, а там во Львові бандеровці і розп'ятий мальчик. Єдина нормальна, скажімо так, реакція.
The only normal reaction,
І це працює.
it does work,
Українські настрої. Так, є дуже
and there is no Ukrainian sentiment.
Як, припустимо, в Росії не випадає. При тому, що є правда.
And what is true? Truth is Euroscepsis. I don't know why. Probably because the Belarusians move a lot, but the majority of Belarusians, even under better conditions, they would be loath to join European Union. Talking about Belarusian gas, yes, they are dependent on the Russian gas because even the gas transportation system of Belarus, it belongs to Gazprom. It's under Gazprom control. Remember when there were negotiations with Ukraine about ability to transport gas in both directions? The representatives of Belarus Ministry of Energy, they were taking part in those negotiations, and the head of the gas agency said that's not feasible for the Belarus. And yes, Ukraine is extremely important for Belarus. And again, when it comes to complacency, it's evaluation of the technical complexness of Belarusian economy compared to the export basket, which means to what extent Belarusian exports are technologically saturated. As you can see, it has the 34th place in the world. in the rating. Another interesting slide is Chatham House sociology dating back to the year 25. Whom do the Belarusians support in the Russian-Ukrainian war? And you can see two equal segments. Those who justify the Russian aggression, about 30 to 32%, and those who do not, it's up to 42%, those who don't justify the Russian aggression. And those are stable segments, which means that propaganda doesn't work. Russian propaganda doesn't work. It's only effective for that small segment who are a natural consumer of Russian and other propaganda content. Segmentation of the society. Again, it's not quite clear in Ukraine that Belarusian society is segmented and flawed. Specifically, there is a rift by values. Every year there are studies of Belarusian identity, and the sociologists identify 5 key groups: Soviet Belarus, conscious Belarus, pro-Russians. So this pro-Russian group is about 7%. It's a stable group. Those who don't see any value in the state of Belarus, the rest of the social groups, they have this sentiment that Belarus is supposed to remain independent, again, with integration or without it. That's one of the points of the consensus. And at the same side, there is a political segmentation. Unfortunately, the Lukashenko's opponents, they lost trust of the majority of population. That's true. And on one hand, it's an opportunity. On the other hand, it's, so to say, it's a problem. Then Lukashenko has basic social groups of voters. The key group is the Soviet Belarusians. And why cannot he guarantee a safe life for himself? Because this fundamental group of voters 15 years ago, they were comprising like 51%, then 10 years ago it was 40%. So even given the free elections, you could guarantee votes for yourself. So in the year 2020, that fraction was 37%, and now it fell down to 24%. And year to year, this group is decreasing. But again, this pro-Russian group remains stable, and the group of neutrals and others, it becomes bigger. So again, it's a field for future information campaigns and political activity and other related activities. However, once again, there is the fact of association with Russian aggression, of Russia using the situation of the years 20 and 21, which resulted in situation of the year 2022. And now let me give you the fact. For example, in Belarus, the dictatorship is in stagnation, and Russian Federation, we can see it in Georgia, in Moldova, they can employ different methods, and Russia has fulfilled one interesting combination after the protests were suppressed against the unfair results of the elections. Putin started making statements that the customs union may work without Belarus because Belarus was refusing to sign the agreement. So Russia see that the algorithm may work, they can employ it, and the absence of other policies in other sectors, the sanctions itself are a reaction. It results in the fact that if there is one fact that employs such a policy and others do not, those who were able to formulate their own plans and follow their path step by step, they get the best results. But again, in the year 2026, geopolitics will be important. The negotiations between the United States and China, the creation of zones of influence. What's specific about Belarus is that China politically builds Belarus into the sphere of influence in the One Belt, One Way initiative and the initiation of the American negotiations track is something that was caused mostly by Russia. Another thing, Turkey and Poland, the change of regional balance, the regional superstates that already shaped their zones of influence. Then in the year 2027, at least 6 geoeconomic projects are going to be initiated that may influence Chinese One Belt, One Way project. And again, our region is involved in those initiatives. So those are the initiatives, practical deployment of which is planned for the year 2027. The negotiation track with the United States, it started in 2024. Lukashenko is trying to sell the political prisoners and stuff like this. Intensification of China's operations and negotiation track of Poland with Lithuanian Republic, with Belarus. They started just recently. Poland wanted to put it in public plane, so they've increased the transit rates, unblocked the negotiations, the practical part of the negotiations with Belarus, and they got quite an important bonus, an agreement with China between the export control agencies, which becomes that Poland becomes, or potentially can become, one of the biggest dual-purpose products in Ukraine. And the basic scenario for Ukraine. For Ukraine, the active phase of the war is still going on, and it's too early to talk about any neighborly strategy. There is a potential front line that needs to be protected, but there are 3 basic scenarios that were covered by this document: a Trump's plan with changes and amendments, which means a prompt freezing. Unfortunately, in this case, for Ukraine, it means minimum subjectivity, because those are the formats imposed from outside, and among those formats are European propositions and American suggestions, which mean complete exemption of Russia from any responsibility, and accountability of Lukashenko as associate in this aggressor also is negated, or at the same time, there are American Chinese tracks in Belarus that run in parallel without any involvement in this project. So from the time perspective for Ukraine, fighting for our subjectivity is something that should have started yesterday. We cannot say everything is lost, but it's going to be difficult. Another option is freezing. For example, if now the result of the negotiations between the United States and China won't be successful, so the circle of potential mediators will be expanded. First, there will be time and more opportunities to play on different interests. So on top of European, we need to have Belarus track. It's important for us to understand what we want to get as a result of this track. And within this track, we may discuss our own goals, our own strategies. And if there is only a passive participation of Ukrainian policy, it will be just a derivative of the policy of our key partners. And continuation of the war in such a format is a transitional state, because the only thing that you may discuss during the war is the security. That's it. And in view of those phases, I hope it's visible. These charts with the text, they will be printed in Dilova, Stolytsia within a week. So the format of freezing means partial lifting of sanctions. And when it comes to Belarus, American track is going to work. If American is not going to work, then Chinese will be active. If not, then probably Lithuanian or others of partners of ours. So it's a question whether Ukraine formulates its own track, because Lithuania and Poland started acting quite intensely to make sure that the format of negotiations between Washington and Minsk would take into account their interests. If Ukraine formulates its own policy in coordination with the partners, then the Ukrainian interests and opportunity to influence the processes will emerge. If not, then we will go along the Polish track most likely. If there is no Polish track, then Chinese one wouldn't work. But again, it's very important to take into account the Belarus political subject in Ukrainian policy. There's a lot of, for example, Belarusian volunteers, but there is no specific policies. There is no political subject who would be a partner for Ukrainian side. And talking about political future, political component, political negotiations, the Lithuanian Republic and Poland, they have certain bonus, like we've taken into consideration your proposals, and now we are going to consult with the Belarusians who are along our border. If, for example, Ukrainians do the same, like they take into consideration all of the assumptions and go to Poland, to Warsaw for advice, for coordination. So again, if Ukraine doesn't have its track, so someone else would decide for us. If there are no tracks, either American or Chinese, again, there should be a political subject that influences the processes in Belarus. And if it does exist, then there will be some policy shaped at least to prevent the absorption of Belarus by Russian Federation. So again, it's a passive and way, but at the same time, there are no other additional factors. When it comes to the war, the situation is more or less the same. It's similar, but there are key four results of preparation. First result is achievement of negotiations infrastructure within which Ukraine and the partners, they share the same position. There is a political organization in the territories of these countries, but there is also a framework that is previously agreed by the neighbors of Belarus, what Lukashenko is supposed to do to make sure the normalization happens. Yet another option is when the neighbors are active, or for example, if in case there is no Belarusian subject emerging in Ukraine, then it's impossible to formulate the full political policy, but at least economic policy with no influence on the global processes. And there are also forms of passive participation when Ukraine is passive, or for example, failure formats when American or Chinese trade just disappears. I apologize, I didn't have enough time to translate it into Ukrainian. But how do I see the reestablishment of any friendly relations? Now, we are at the point when there is no shooting in the board, and the security can be ensured by the sentiment of population, the armed forces of Ukraine stand in the borders, and certain concerns are part of Lukashenko. Because if he sees that his country is falling down, he will be among the first ones to give orders to protect it. But again, as long as Russians don't receive anything, it plays in our favor. Lukashenko is a dictator, but he's still Belarusian, and unlike Yanukovych, any failure of Belarus is his failure. But the key factor here is the dependence on Russian Federation, the operation of Russian propaganda, fear of Russian Federation, and the fear of security is something that can be present today, and it's guaranteed mostly by the military capabilities and also by the sentiment of the society. But when it comes to sentiment of the society, Ukraine doesn't work on Belarusian axis at all. We're just lucky our neighbors don't believe Russian propaganda, but again, it's quite an important factor. I was looking for a number of people convicted in Belarus per 10,000, and depending on a region, it's 5 to 6 persons per 10,000, up to 10 to 17. But if we take only the high treason article in Belarus army, from 25 to 33 persons were convicted. The total number of personnel in Belarusian armed forces is 47, which amounts to 7 people per 10,000. And with such sentiment in the army, you cannot start a war. So the percentage is higher than among the civilians. Then for stability, another stage. Another stage, the next one, during which we can start doing something. So after the war, there will be such factors as cultural similarity, importance of cooperation. But for stability is the stage when you have a partner and you know that when your partner says something, you have to trust them. Lukashenko doesn't enjoy any trust on part of the Ukrainians, but this trust is very difficult to reestablish. So after the war, what can we do? It's a moment when you start working with the society, and Ukraine in this case can start planning for some things, quite an easy one. For example, if there is a safety
В військовому плані, в плані політичному агресії Білорусі є, в тому числі настрої суспільства, треба з цим
against aggression from Belarus. If there's such a safety is a public sentiment, then we have to work with this. If there is a lot of myth, on one hand, there are Belarusians and Ukrainians sitting and thinking, what can we do in the future, no matter how bad it is now. So here we also need some Belarusian groups of influence inside Ukraine as a partners, and this is a matter of open borders. Today, it seems absolutely incredible, but take a look at the sociology. Those open borders, those travels of the every citizens, they make sure Russian propaganda doesn't work. But again, any country, or any citizen of any country coming to Ukraine, they meet the representatives of Ukrainian authorities twice, as they come and as they live in the border. So now we had 2 million visits, 2 million border crossings. So is it difficult to print out some million of paper notes? For example, if they go to the sea, the Belarusians, on the way to the sea, to the Ukrainian sea, they could take some time to get themselves familiarized with those leaflets. But again, the damaged Russian material, we could install them near small hotels just to make some small museums. I apologize my cynicism, but there's going to be a cool selfie place everywhere, near every hotel for the tourists. There's a lot of demonstration material in the fields. But another thing we have to take into account is how to evaluate the matter of accountability. There are two statements that contradict each other. There should be accountability for Lukashenko, including financial accountability. Another statement, simple compensation, such as reparations, is the most dangerous way for Ukraine. Why? Because now let's count the number of days that Belarus was involved in the aggression. It's like 1% of the time. Now the difference of mentalities, taking into account the financial component, 2 to 3% out of 300 billion. Again, this difference in mentality, if for Belarusians it's measured in money, Lukashenko is Belarusian. For them, it would mean that the record of Ukraine goes like this. If you want to get prepared to this conflict again, so you better get prepared. So we have to present some benefits to them. A good example is the post-war cooperation between Indonesia and Japan. They didn't call it reparations, they were investments. There was investment of technologies in production sector of Indonesia, and 51% was belonging to Indonesians. So you cannot enter the market otherwise, but the company is getting technologies, they're getting products, but at the same time there are some safeties. Another component in terms of trade, it's important to demonstrate the difference between Russia and the others. If you let someone to your market, well, but you will have to do this during the years 22, 23. Ukraine was buying goods from Belarus because they don't have their own manufacturer. But one thing is when you buy it because you don't have other choice, but whole different thing is when you set your requirements. For example, a company that ships to Ukraine, they don't have to have ties with Russia. It's a political issue. It's either Ukraine and the rest of the world or Russia only. And some companies will start thinking that the businesses with Ukraine will yield them more benefits. At this moment, the calculator triggers in your head like, wow, this is way better. And we should set way more such political traps for that. And another issue is a political issue, yes, because there are such things as a public sentiment, but it's a matter of whom you work for. Again, there is a Ukrainian agenda for the followers of Lukashenko, for the pro-Russian citizens, but there is no political agenda for the neutral ones. For example, before the full-scale invasion, Belarus was quite interested about Ukrainian innovations, like innovations in Ukrainian medical sector, so Ukraine has something to share. But again, under some conditions that those knowledge and practical skills will be handed over to the opponents of Lukashenko. So thank you. I would like to give other experts opportunity to be outspoken, and there will be a number of questions to what extent do you agree with the statements that were made? What's most important for you? There was a lot said about Ukrainian track, and the question for you is whether we really need to think about it now. Is it really the time when we need to work on this track? And what's your vision of agency of Belarusians in Ukraine? Well, whether we want it or not, but we're doomed to cooperate with Belarus after some time. For the time being, it's no secret that we are in fact in a situation when there's a number of, so to say, unfriendly is not quite a good word, but countries that are not quite friendly to us. And on the other hand, the situation may deteriorate even more. So we should work with it. It's not only about Belarus, but also Slovakia, Hungary, and first of all, Poland. So talking more broadly, the first thing we should start with is, for the time being, we're entering the new stage of creation of the so-called bipolar world that many want to compare to the Cold War. Fortunately or unfortunately, the history knows no repetitions. The situation will be completely different from the Cold War. And what's the biggest difference is that the United States and USSR were ready to fight for their satellites back in 1945. They were ready to start wars. They were ready to send their troops to those territories. For the time being, neither China nor the United States are going to fight for their satellites, for their allies. And basically, we're seeing a mixed up world in which this or that country submits to 2 or 3 other countries at the same time. And Belarus is a classic example. They are perceived as a pro-Russian marionette on our end, but we clearly understand that until this moment, Lukashenko was serving 2 masters, Moscow and Beijing, and with no doubt, we should pay attention to this factor. That's one important thing. Another track that was said by the United States of America back in 2024 will definitely be continued in 2026 and sooner or later, but together with the end of the Russian-Ukrainian war, there will be warming of relations between Belarus and Europe, Belarus and United States, and eventually, if we are going to continue understanding that the world has changed, we will have to change our relations with Belarus as well. And whether there will be Lukashenko or not, we will have to think how to normalize, definitely how to normalize in future, not during the Cold War, but the relations with Belarus should be improved. There should be a two-way road. And should we start thinking about it now? Yes, definitely we should, because that's a famous phrase ascribed to Bismarck, that there should be a plan for every war, but this plan breaks after the first cannon breaks. But if you don't have a plan, you will definitely lose. So we have to think how and what to invest in our relations with Belarus. And getting back to this day, we have to pay attention to the fact that currently there is no threat emanating from Belarus when it comes to military threats or war threats. And in some foreseeable perspective, there's nothing like that to be seen, and it's a huge merit of China, in my opinion. However, if we talk about, say, we have one negative area in relations between Ukraine and Belarus, it's the Dodgers, the the State Bodyguard Service of Ukraine caught 3 men who were trying to flee the Ukrainian army through Belarus. Those are only those whom they managed to get. And Polish media mentioned that last week there were explosions on the railways in Europe, and behind those explosions are Ukrainians who crossed the border to Poland from Belarus. So we have this tense track here, and we have to understand that those who want to flee from Belarus are facing the risk of interrogation in Belarusian KGB, and they can be recruited for such activities, and then with the hands of Ukrainians recruited by Russians, such acts of terrorism may be fulfilled in the territory of Ukraine. So this is something to pay more attention to. This is something that should be covered by Ukrainian media more. So as soon as you cross the border with Belarus, you will definitely be interrogated by Belarusian KGB and Russian FSB with all relevant consequences. Thank you, Iaroslav. Please, the floor is yours. So what are your reflections based on what you've heard? Well, in fact, I agree with Mr. Ihar almost in all things. When it comes to scenarios, I think we could take something broader, but somehow probably some positive thinking works, but we're talking about more or less positive or absolutely positive things. I would pay attention to the fact that history is non-linear thing. So among the scenarios, we could also consider bringing combat operations to the territory of Belarus. I'm not talking about high probability of such scenarios, but the exercises West 2025 demonstrated that the worst case scenario did not unfold, but those options are not going anywhere. Again, I share this opinion about China's influence, but we have to understand that Russia is so, how do I put it diplomatically? They are so weird that they can neglect any Lukashenko's interests at any moment, and they can implement a direct control, effectively occupying Belarus. Yes, currently there are no preconditions for that, at least based on what we see, but as a hypothetical scenario, we should also consider it, because in the year, it's year 2026 that's coming, and hope that the hostilities in Ukraine would cease are a little bit vague. Now there are negotiations, settlement of relations. I think that's a way more outlined perspective than year 2026. I would discuss some more drastic scenarios. When it comes to influence of Ukraine on Belarus information space, I wouldn't say it completely doesn't exist. I could mention Radio Razzia. We have a show, a podcast called A View from Ukraine that covers the western regions of Belarus. Well, probably that's not a hell of a global influence, but still it's there. I hope that Ukrainian bloggers and Belarusian bloggers coming from Ukraine are popular in Belarus, so I think not everything is that bad. However, there is a lot of things to be done, and obviously I would like this activity to be supported by Ukrainian state rather than only by some specific media or influencers. That's probably it. Mr. Zmicier, well, hopefully I can be a live example of how Ukrainians understand Belarusian language, and I would start with the fact that I read the report in full. There is hard copy that I read. I can disagree with some technical things. However, when it comes to overall assessment, I agree strategically. Strategically, there is no big difference. What looks important for me? First of all, what was said about the information. Radio Razzia doesn't cover a major part of Belarus. And we were talking to the editor-in-chief, and it's being actively jammed. FM range covers only a couple percent of the Belarusian population. Definitely, there are some bloggers, political bloggers, because there are Ukrainian bloggers who are not political, who are popular in Belarus, but I think Balakhanov is the only Ukrainian blogger having influence in Belarus. I mean, talking about political bloggers, and his audience is about 100,000%, which is a small percentage for Belarus. So I think it's a complete failure. Another important thing that Mr. Ihar mentioned, we are being presented to each other as similar nations, and we extrapolate it on each other, but it's not so. You have to live a couple of years in Ukraine to start understanding. Like you have to understand Belarus, and you have to feel Ukraine, and that's the fundamental difference. Why we project, talking in basic linguistics, you have to understand Belarus and you have to feel Ukraine, you have to sense it, so to say. So talking about agreement or disagreement is a fundamental thing, and relations between the peoples You know that the presidents, they come and go, even such as Lukashenko, but relations between the peoples is the fundamental thing that didn't allow Lukashenko to force Belarusian army to enter Ukraine. And it means a lot to me. It seems very important, and it's the sector that is worth working on. What's also important when it comes to information policy, where can it come from? It can come from the strategy. I joined opposition movement in Belarus in 1988, and starting from 88, from the beginning of 90s, the Belarusian opposition, whether right or left, liberal or conservative, were asking our partners the same question. We need the Belarus strategy, bloc strategy, or country strategy. That was the question we were asking from Poland, Lithuania, Latvia, and it was never developed. Probably there is a document, but it doesn't work. The only strategy that was put together, it was put together by Mr. Ambassador Ihar. Unfortunately, it was not accepted because, and when there is no strategy, there is no information policy. So I think that it's important to develop such strategy. Mr. Ihar has already mentioned it, the different subjects, agency, partners, but with no strategy, there will be no information policy. Without analysis of scenarios, there can be no clear strategy. Now let's proceed to the scenarios. Our unchanged president Lukashenko can leave us just because of his age, and this scenario is never presented. It would be desirable to have it because, for example, there was a mention of Russian troops, but for what I understand, even Belarusian opposition doesn't work with such a scenario. Also, involvement of Belarus in Russian aggression, either in combination with Russian forces or alone. You know, it seems quite probable to me. Those attempts to convince Trump will continue, and at the same time, negotiations will not go anywhere. What also seems very important to me, I would say such a view from the Belarusian perspective is we say at Belarusian Democratic Forces, I mean, I'm being criticized for saying opposition, but unfortunately what's called Belarusian Democratic Forces is not quite force and it's not quite democratic. So I will use the word oppositions. And inside this opposition, we have a fraction, you know, there is a rift, just like Mr. Magda is saying, the fraction of Belarusians who wanted to fight the regime, they took up the arms and went to fight in Ukraine, and those who wanted a good life took the money and left for Warsaw. So we have these two fractions. Lithuania had influence in Belarusian policy. I don't remember. There were centers that moved over there. Well, again, it's important to develop a policy. When it comes to the policy, until the year 2013, the key grant providing structures for Belarus, they were based in Kiev, and Belarusian opposition were coming to Kiev. And even until the year 2020, remember, Ms. Tikhanovska, there was a strict line between where the people were going before, and if, for example, a person was attending Ukraine previously, it's not a matter of a foreign influence. They were just communicating with the Ukrainians. So for Democrats and non-Democrats who used to come to Ukraine quite actively in businesses or otherwise, you know, for them, Ukraine was the central country. They were pursuing Ukrainian interests, and for those who started coming to Lithuania, You see, for example, you try to ask them, who is this Crimea, and they definitely don't pursue any Ukrainian interest. Again, there is infrastructure, there is some support on part of the country, specifically when it comes to maintaining the office and this Polish fraction. This Polish infrastructure, Belsat Geta Polsh, is Poland. Radio Racja is also controlled by Poland. So again, why am I in Kiev rather than in Warsaw? Because there is some part of Belarusians, like the Kalinovsky regiment, who have no illusions that we will be able to achieve something, to seek something from the Polish or Lithuanian politicians when it comes to Belarusian track, because they used to be afraid, they are still afraid, and they will continue being afraid shortly, and it means the reactive policy. And starting from the year 2022, there are some hopes on part of the Russian opposition, and it's like non-crystallized, it's dispersed. Dispersed, it's like a machine connected to Ukraine, to Belarusian volunteers who fight in Ukraine, who understand that the matter of Lukashenko is not about Lukashenko, it's about Putin and Moscow. And if we don't find a solution to the Russian issue, nothing will be solved with Lukashenko. What also was not added to this report? The information. First, there is a fraction of bloggers like Radio Freedom, Radio Racja. We have different segments of those that are funded from Europe but work in Belarus. But as Ihar mentioned, there's something that was never done in Belarusian policy by the West, in Belarusian politics. So work with those neutral, those who perceive Lukashenko as the lesser of evils. Nothing was done on this track, and another role is become a mediator for Ukraine, communication between Belarusian opposition and Belarusian officials. What Ihar suggested about the journeys, the travels, so it seems to be quite important, because as people say in Belarusian opposition, we are red and white, and we need to be red and green. We recognize one flag, others recognize another flag. So I think as a mediator for Ukrainian negotiations, that could be a cool role for Belarus. Well, thank you. I would like to thank you. Unfortunately, we're running out of time and we have to summarize everything. I would like to thank everyone for this wonderful conversation. Unfortunately, there was too little time to discuss everything, but at the same time, we can see the challenges are huge. We understand that for Ukrainians, it's difficult to even think about any interaction with Belarus, but at the same time, there are experts, those who started that journey. So I would like to thank you, thank all of the experts and our armed forces, thanks to whom we can gather and hold events like this. Glory to Ukraine, glory to the heroes.